Well, Lara Spirit and George Parker. Lara, so 4 p.m. tomorrow, it's going to be, to use a contradictory analogy, it's going to be high noon. And it's going to be tough for Boris Johnson, tough for Rishi Sunak and Whitehall, probably tough for all of them in different ways.
Yeah, I think you're right, and it'll be very interesting to see what happens to this effect. I think one of the most interesting things that we've seen over the course of the week has been the language coarsening on the side of Boris Johnson's team, to the extent that most recently they've asked for Oliver Dowden, Deputy Prime Minister, to release his own diary entries from that period, and we saw kind of off the record coded swipes at the idea that there's plenty of other things to come out about other people at the top of the Conservative Party if this is to get much nastier. I think you only need to listen to Boris Johnson in that last clip to realise that he is absolutely furious about this, and his team are absolutely furious about this, and feel, their defence that to hand over these their full diaries would breach national security and government rules on disclosure. I think they'll fight tooth and nail on this. But I think there was also that kind of slightly rich irony that we saw earlier on in the week, where Boris Johnson was and his team were attacking the Cabinet Office for having authorised handing those entries over to the Police and the Privileges Committee, only for it to be followed with the Cabinet Office themselves saying, actually, we might actually not want the full release of these WhatsApps after all. So I think there's a lot going on here with regard to ministerial privacy, that's for sure. And I think you heard that in what Rosa said just then. And I think they're very aware that there's a lot here that is semi-unprecedented, and that actually they need to be careful the precedent they set with releasing personal communications. But that in this instance, I just can't see how they avoid doing it.
And on the raw politics, before we get George into what on earth's going to happen after 4 p.m. tomorrow, I mean, Team Johnson, they really are getting bare-knuckled about this, aren't they? Going for Oliver Dowden, suggesting that he is at the Cabinet Office, part of this conspiracy to do down Boris Johnson, which is also, by the way, a sort of veiled swipe at the Prime Minister as well.
Yeah, I mean, it's become sort of slightly muddied now, hasn't it? Because Boris Johnson and his supporters have been highlighting Oliver Dowden's role, they think at least, as being sort of the dark hand behind the release of his diaries to the police over those alleged get-togethers at Chequers. But now, of course, there's a sort of subplot, which is now the Cabinet Office, led by Oliver Dowden, is refusing to hand over more evidence from Boris Johnson, from WhatsApps and so forth, to the investigation. So it's become quite murky, but as Lara was saying there, I mean, there's a whole load of government business conducted on WhatsApp, and I think lots of ministers now will be considering their use of that medium, because you sort of tend to think of WhatsApps as being a sort of fairly secret, sort of end-to-end encrypted and so on, and as a consequence, all sorts of things will have been said on those WhatsApp messages.
Yes.
Some of which will have been embarrassing to Boris Johnson, some of which I suspect could potentially be embarrassing to Rishi Sunak, who was Chancellor at the time, of course.
Yeah, I mean, what do you think, Lara and George? I mean, how do you guess? I guess maybe we can only guess at this point, but how do you think the government, the Cabinet Office, are going to deal with this? I mean, there's been talk, as we say, of a judicial review, going to the court and trying to fight it out there, or maybe reaching a deal with the inquiry. What's your guess, Lara?
My guess, but it is, just as informed as you, is that I think they might actually end up having to hand them over. Of course, one of the other interesting things is the way in which they'll be used by the inquiry, how public they will be. I don't actually know the answer to this. Could you give them over on the condition that they aren't made, available for the public in any form whatsoever? Obviously, I'm not sure that that's going to be possible in a situation where they actually find something there that they think will be explicitly relevant to their findings. They'll need to obviously say why. So obviously there are loads of complications to it, but I just can't see how denying access to them doesn't make this much more problematic for actually everybody involved, because it just means that none of these questions ever go away and none of them are ever resolved.
It does seem, George, that Lady Hallett, the chair of the COVID inquiry, means to use her powers. She's rattling her sword and talking about criminal sanctions, but that in itself tells you that she means to have her way.
Yeah, I mean, unusually, they found someone to run a public inquiry who's actually going to really go for it by the looks of it. I mean, threatening criminal sanctions. I mean, it's interesting, the government's saying that these messages are unambiguously irrelevant to the inquiry. Well, I mean, Baroness Hallett said, well, she'll be the one to decide that. And I think the answer is, if they are totally irrelevant to the inquiry, they won't see the light of day. That's the understanding, that you'd only get to see those that are relevant to the COVID inquiry. I mean, it sounds like Oliver Dowden, the Cabinet Office, will try to find some sort of legal halfway house where they get some sort of legal intermediary and try to adjudicate on whether these are irrelevant to the inquiry or not. think the danger for the government of going down that route is it looks like they're stalling the inquiry and dragging their feet. And again, that leaves them open to all sorts of allegations. I mean, what I find really interesting about this story is that, seeing Boris Johnson sort of defending his behaviour, the COVID, all seems a long way in the rear view mirror. And a lot of the people who were involved at the time, of course, including Matt Hancock, including Boris Johnson, Dominic Cummings, are now outside of the tent. But there are still some people, like the Prime Minister, who are very much in the tent and are still in the tent. And, with this inquiry starting later this year, this will, I suspect, stop looking like sort of ancient history to some people and start becoming very contemporary politics when we learn a bit more about how the government handled this crisis in the crucial months leading up to the next election.
Well, I'm John Pienaar, and if you found that interesting, we are here each day, Monday to Thursday, 5 o'clock till 7 o'clock on Drive, and from 7 till 8, Pienaar and Friends, where we discuss the big stories of the day each day on Times Radio.